11 men were left in the water after a Japanese destroyer cut PT-109 in two. In the night of the 1st to the 2nd of August 1943, in Blackett Strait in the Central Solomon Islands, Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy was on the bridge of PT-109 during a U.S. point boat interception patrol mounted after the Battle of Kula Gulf. His boat was idling on one engine to reduce weight, a documented detail from survivor accounts. Across that same water, Japanese destroyer traffic through the slot had become a repeated high-speed run. American PT crews had been sent out to stop it. The Japanese side had reason for confidence. Destroyer runs had pushed troops and supplies through these waters again and again, often at speed and at night, while the Americans were still trying to make their small wooden boats effective in darkness. What Kennedy and his crew did not know was that the attack they expected was about to become survival. Within roughly 6 days, 11 survivors from PT-109 would be found alive after moving across several small islands. Before that rescue, their boat would vanish in seconds, one crewman would be badly burned, and the men left in the water would face current, wreckage, and nearby enemy patrols. The operation began in a crowded battle space. On the night of the 1st to the 2nd of August 1943, 15 U.S. Navy point boats were deployed in and around Blackett Strait after the fighting off Kolombangara and the Battle of Kula Gulf. Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy commanded PT-109, one of the 80-foot Elko motor torpedo boats that formed part of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2. These boats were wooden, lightly built craft, powered by 3 Packard gasoline engines, and armed to strike first with 21-inch torpedoes. They were dangerous only if they detected the target in time. The opposing ship later identified in the record was the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami. A destroyer on a high-speed run through the slot carried steel, mass, and speed that no PT boat could match at close range. The Americans expected to intercept destroyers moving through restricted waters at night. The Japanese expected to complete another fast movement through an area where PT attacks had become a recurring risk but not a decisive barrier. That difference in expectation mattered. One side needed surprise to attack. The other only needed seconds and momentum to survive contact. Earlier that night, the American interception effort had already been weakened by confusion, missed contact, and the difficulty of coordinating many small craft in darkness. PT-109 was one of 15 boats committed, but they were spread across a broad area, and not all made contact at the same time or under the same conditions. In practical terms, that left individual boats to search, wait, and react with very little warning. Kennedy's boat moved into position in Blackett Strait as part of that wider effort. The 80-foot Elko design could move fast, but speed alone did not solve the problem. A PT boat attacking at night had to see first, identify fast, turn into position, and fire its torpedoes before a destroyer crossed the engagement window. If the target appeared at close range, the equations changed immediately. A Japanese destroyer on a return run through the slot could cover water too quickly for a wooden boat to recover. Survivor accounts place PT-109 idling on one engine to reduce wake and avoid showing its position. That choice made tactical sense. It also limited immediate acceleration at the worst possible moment. The crew were looking for destroyers. The destroyers were driving hard through waters where American PT activity had already forced repeated night evasions and collision risk. At that point, survival became the mission before anyone aboard PT-109 could have named it that. Then, out of the dark, a destroyer shape appeared close aboard, and the next decision was no longer whether to attack but whether there was any time left to act. Kennedy had only seconds. Survivor accounts agree that the dark shape appeared close aboard on PT-109's starboard side. The destroyer was later identified as Amagiri, under Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami, returning at high speed through Blackett Strait. Kennedy turned to starboard to bring his torpedoes to bear and to avoid the oncoming ship, but the range was too short. In his account for The New Yorker, Kennedy said the destroyer seemed to loom out of the darkness at roughly 200 to 300 yards. At that distance, an 80-foot wooden PT boat had almost no time to accelerate, turn, and fire. Amagiri struck PT-109 on the starboard side. The collision cut the boat in two near the forward gasoline tanks. The impact threw men into the water and set off fuel fires on the surface. 2 members of the crew were lost in the collision. The documented total is 2 dead and 11 survivors. The forward section of the hull remained afloat for a time. The stern section, with the engine room, sank quickly. What the Americans saw was confusion at close range. The crew had expected a torpedo attack opportunity. Instead, they were in the water among burning fuel and wreckage. Kennedy, who had been knocked onto the deck, began gathering survivors around the floating bow section. Motor Machinist's Mate 1, C. Patrick H. McMahon, had been badly burned. Other men had cuts, bruises, and shock, but most could still swim. One survivor account recalled men clinging to the timber and charred remains of the boat while trying to account for the crew. What the Japanese knew at that moment was limited. Amagiri did not stop to pick up survivors. Japanese destroyer operations in the Central Solomons were already conducted under pressure, in waters where PT boat attacks and sudden contact were expected. Whether Amagiri's crew fully understood what they had hit in that instant has been debated, but the result was clear. PT-109 had ceased to exist as a fighting craft. For the men at the bow section, the first decision came immediately. Stay with the wreck and hope friendly boats returned, or leave it and try for land they could barely make out in the darkness. It unfolded that way because PT-109 was built for ambush, not collision. The Elco 80-foot class was a plywood-hulled motor torpedo boat powered by 3 Packard 4M 2500 engines. On paper, that gave high speed, roughly 40 knots under favorable conditions. It also meant gasoline engines, a light wooden structure, and almost no protection against a steel destroyer displacing well over 1,000 tons and moving at destroyer speed. The tactical problem was made worse by the exact choice Kennedy had made before contact. Idling on one engine reduced wake and helped conceal the boat. Survivor testimony and post-action accounts support that. The cost was immediate acceleration. Bringing the other engines fully in and turning an 80-foot hull in darkness took time PT-109 did not have. Kennedy could still attempt a turn to starboard. He could not change physics. The torpedo boat's main weapon also favored first sight, not last-second reaction. PT-109 carried 21-inch torpedoes in tubes. To use them, the crew needed enough warning to identify the target, line up a firing angle, and launch before the target crossed the bow. At 200 to 300 yards, as Kennedy later described the range, that sequence collapsed. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami was bringing Amagiri through a combat zone where American PT boats had already forced repeated caution. Yet caution for a destroyer did not mean slowing to PT boat speed. The Japanese belief that high-speed nighttime movement could still push through was often correct. The American belief was that small boats could break that movement if they struck first. In this case, Amagiri saw or reached PT-109 before PT-109 could execute an attack, and a wooden offensive platform became wreckage in a few seconds. In the first hours after the collision, survival depended on order, not rescue. Kennedy and the other survivors gathered at the floating bow section and accounted for the living. The documented total was 11 survivors. 2 men had been killed in the collision. Patrick H. McMahon's burns were the most serious immediate injury. The men stayed with the wreckage for several hours because it still floated and because leaving it meant entering open water at night. There was no quick American recovery. PT operations that night had already been confused, and PT-109's loss was not immediately understood in full by nearby boats or headquarters. That mattered. A boat split in darkness left little visible trace, and the survivors were now separated from radio contact, propulsion, and their assigned patrol line. The Japanese side moved on. Amagiri continued her run and did not pause for a search. That, too, reflected the tactical conditions in the Solomons. Destroyers moving through Blackett Strait faced air attack by day, PT boats by night, and constant pressure to complete transport and combat missions on schedule. The immediate Japanese reaction preserved the ship, but it also meant the Americans in the water were left to their own decisions. As the night and early morning passed, the floating bow became less reliable. The injured men could not stay exposed indefinitely. Kennedy had to judge distance, current, and endurance without certainty. Survivor accounts describe the next objective as a small island visible against the darkness. The decision was no longer about saving the boat. It was about whether 11 exhausted men, including one badly burned sailor, could abandon the wreck and cross enemy-held water under their own power. At daylight, the bow section was no longer a refuge but a trap. The men had been on it for hours, exposed and drifting, when Kennedy decided they had to leave it and swim for the nearest land, the tiny islet then called Plum Pudding Island. The distance is usually given as about 3.5 miles. It was not a group swim in good order. Patrick H. McMahon, the engine room man with severe burns, could not manage it alone, and Kennedy towed him by gripping the strap of his life jacket in his teeth. Survivor accounts agree on the method because it was so awkward and so punishing. The island they reached offered almost nothing. Plum Pudding was small, low, and uninhabited. There was no fresh water there. There was also very little food. The men found coconuts, but the island could not support 11 exhausted sailors for long. That is one reason the story did not stop with the first swim. Reaching land ended immediate drowning risk. It did not solve survival. Kennedy then began making solo swims into Ferguson Passage, trying to sight or signal friendly PT boats moving through the channel. These efforts are often compressed into one dramatic image, but they were repeated and dangerous. Each trip meant entering open water again, with current, fatigue, and the real possibility of drifting too far or being seen. The survivors were close to Japanese-held territory in a combat zone where barge traffic and patrol movement were active facts, not abstractions. The men shifted islands because geography forced them to. From Plum Pudding they later moved to Olasana Island, where coconuts were more plentiful, and from there Kennedy and another survivor made for Nauru Island in search of water and a better lookout point. Nauru had a Japanese position, so they withdrew. The move that mattered most was to Olasana, because that island at least offered food and, nearby, access to drinking water from another small island. The pattern was constant. Short decisions made under physical collapse. One survivor detail keeps the scale honest. McMahon was not simply tired. He was dealing with extensive burns from the fuel fire while still moving island to island through salt water and tropical heat. That fact alone explains why every change of position was a risk. The larger problem was now plain. 11 men could keep themselves alive one more day, but the Solomons were full of channels, reefs, and enemy movement that could hide them indefinitely. The rescue problem was shaped less by drama than by terrain. Blackett Strait, Ferguson Passage, Rindova, Olasana, Nauru, and the many small islands between them created a map where a missing boat could vanish into short distances that were still operationally enormous. In the Solomons campaign, a few miles of reef, current, and broken coastline could defeat ordinary search methods. A PT boat on patrol might pass near survivors and never see them. That was especially true in early August 1943. PT-109 had been lost during a confused night action after major naval fighting around Kolombangara. Reports were incomplete. Boats were scattered. Search coverage depended on what commanders thought had happened, and at first no headquarters possessed a clean picture of where Kennedy's men had drifted or swum. Survival became the mission not only for the crew in the water, but because no outside command system could immediately take over. Official histories of the Solomon Islands fighting stress the same operational reality again and again. Night movement, island clutter, and uncertain communication distorted every decision. Japanese destroyers and barges still used these waters because American daylight airpower had made daytime movement costly. That pushed both sides into darkness. The result was a battlespace where sudden contact was expected, but isolated men were still easy to miss. The Japanese side had its own reason for tension. By August 1943, fast destroyer runs and barge routes through the Central Solomons were increasingly hazardous under American pressure. Even when those runs got through, they were operating in waters where PT interception, air attack, and coastwatcher reporting had made routine movement dangerous. Fear in this context appears not in rhetoric but in behavior. Movement at night, dispersal, speed, and constant expectation of contact. That is why the PT-109 survival story mattered beyond one crew. It exposed the limits of small craft warfare in the Solomons and the equal limits of command over geography. In those waters, technology could vanish in seconds, and then endurance, local knowledge, and improvisation took over. The next step would depend not on a search grid, but on a human link inside the islands themselves. Lieutenant J.G. John F. Kennedy remains central because his documented actions after the collision were physical, repeated, and sustained. He helped organize the survivors on the floating bow, then led the swim to Plum Pudding Island while towing motor machinist's mate 1, C. Patrick H. McMahon by the life jacket strap. Later he made further swims into Ferguson Passage in hopes of flagging a PT boat. Kennedy survived the ordeal, remained in the Navy, and after the war entered politics before becoming President of the United States. McMahon's part of the story gives the episode its hardest edge. He had been badly burned in the explosion and fuel fire, yet he survived the hours on the wreckage, the long tow to shore, and the island moves that followed. His survival was not passive. It was the measure the rest of the crew had to organize around. He survived the war and later gave accounts of the sinking and the struggle afterward. The deadlock broke because two Solomon Islanders entered the story at exactly the right point. Bayuku Gasa and Aroni Kumana were scouts working for Sub-Lieutenant Arthur Reginald Evans of the Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve, one of the coast watchers supporting Allied operations. When Gasa and Kumana encountered the survivors, the gap between stranded men and Allied command finally narrowed. Kennedy gave them a message carved on a coconut shell for Evans. That object became the most famous single artifact of the episode. Kennedy later kept the coconut, and it was preserved. Evans was the officer who could turn contact into action. Once the scouts reached him with the message, the problem changed from finding proof of life to arranging extraction through the Allied network already operating in the islands. The Coast Watchers had long been one of the Allies' most effective human systems in the Solomons precisely because radios, charts, and patrol plans could not solve every local problem. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami survived the war as the commander associated with Amagiri's collision with PT-109. His ship had moved on that night. The men in the water endured because others in the islands carried the story forward, and that left only the question of how quickly rescue could now reach them. Once Evans had Kennedy's message, the delay ended. On the night of the 7th to the 8th of August 1943, PT-157, commanded by Lieutenant William D. Libino, reached the area and took the survivors off. The result was complete and stark. 11 men from PT-109 were rescued. 2 had been lost in the collision. After roughly 6 days of swimming, drifting, hiding, and moving between small islands, the crew was back inside the Allied chain of command. What followed was not a single burst of publicity but a sequence of wartime paperwork, medical attention, and operational judgment. Patrick H. McMahon's burns required treatment. Kennedy and the others were debriefed, and the loss of PT-109 entered official Navy records as part of the hard record of PT operations in the Solomons. That mattered because the episode was not treated only as a personal survival tale. It was also evidence of the conditions under which those patrols were being fought. Short-range night contact, incomplete information, and crews left exposed when interception plans broke down. The larger campaign moved quickly. In mid-August, Allied forces landed at Vella La Vella, continuing the push up the Solomons while bypassing heavily contested positions. Japanese destroyer and barge movement through these waters did not end with PT-109. But the pressure on that movement increased through late 1943 as Allied air, naval, and coastwatcher networks tightened. In that setting, the PT-109 episode fit a broader truth rather than changing it by itself. Small craft could disrupt, they could harass, they could force caution, yet in waters like Blackett Strait, endurance, local scouts, and coastwatcher links could matter as much as torpedoes. The rescue also fixed certain names in the wartime record. Byuku Gasa and Ironi Kumana were no longer just local scouts in a remote chain of islands. They had become the men who carried proof that survivors were still alive. Evans had turned that proof into extraction. Libino had completed it, so the immediate question was answered by the 8th of August. The harder question remained: did PT-109 matter mainly because a future president survived it, or because it exposed, in one compressed week, what this island war actually demanded of the men fighting it? PT-109 is treated as a turning point less because it altered strategy on a map than because it fixed the reality of Solomon Islands combat in a form the record could not easily lose. Before the collision, PT service was often discussed in terms of interception, torpedoes, and aggressive night action. Afterward, this single case showed the other side of that work with unusual clarity. A patrol boat could disappear almost instantly, and survival might depend on swimming strength, island geography, and Melanesian scouts moving by canoe. That is why standard accounts keep returning to it. Samuel Eliot Morison, in his History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, treated the episode within the larger pattern of the Solomons campaign rather than as an isolated legend. The point was practical. PT boats were part of a larger pressure system against Japanese night movement, but they were operating in conditions that often stripped away every advantage except persistence. On the Japanese side, the record matters because it confirms that this was remembered there as a real combat event. Later Japanese accounts identified Amagiri as the destroyer involved, and Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami remained the documented commander tied to the collision. Accounts differ on exactly what Amagiri's bridge crew saw in the last seconds, but not on the result. A destroyer continuing a wartime run had cut an American PT boat in two and left survivors behind in contested water. That is the conversion point in the story. What began as a destroyer run through waters where PT boats were expected became, in the surviving record on both sides, an admission of what those waters had turned into. Not clean attacks, but confused, close, punishing contact where local intelligence and rescue links could decide whether men lived. Kennedy's later fame guaranteed that PT-109 would be preserved in public memory. The reason it stayed there is broader. The episode gave the Pacific War a documented human scale. 11 rescued, 2 lost, 1 carved message carried by scouts. From there, the story passes from operations and reports to the men who had to live with it afterward. For John Fitzgerald Kennedy, PT-109 became part of a public life that carried the episode far beyond the Solomons. He remained in the Navy after the rescue, received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his conduct in the incident, and left wartime service with lasting back problems. He entered Congress in 1947, the Senate in 1953, and the presidency in 1961. He was assassinated in 1963. Patrick H. McMahon lived on after the war and remained one of the most direct witnesses to what the crew endured in the water and on the islands. Lieutenant Commander Kohei Hanami survived the war as the Japanese officer linked in the record to Amagiri that night. The object that carried the rescue remains the clearest surviving detail. Kennedy's message, carved on a coconut husk for Evans through Gasa and Kumana, was preserved and later kept by Kennedy. It survives as a museum artifact at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston. That small piece of shell says more about the rescue than any monument could. It is not a symbol invented afterward. It was part of the operation. The story is also fixed to place. Kennedy Island in the Solomon Islands preserves the geography of the ordeal itself. Plum Pudding Island was later renamed for Kennedy. The John F. Kennedy Presidential Library holds records and material tied to the episode. PT-109 has also remained present in books, archival collections, documentaries, and memorial culture because the facts are unusually concrete. A destroyer, a split hull, several islands, one coastwatcher network, one rescue boat on the night of the 7th to the 8th of August. Bayuku Gasa and Uroni Kumana belong in that memory as well. Without them, the message does not move, Evans does not act, and Libano does not arrive. Their canoe journey was part of the rescue chain, not a side note. The opening contradiction is no longer a contradiction. 11 men were left in the water after a Japanese destroyer cut PT-109 in two, and they avoided capture or drowning because they kept moving, found water, reached scouts, and turned one carved message into rescue. Once PT-109 was split apart, survival became the mission, and they completed it. If stories like this matter to you, the next one goes even deeper.